I want to talk a little bit more now about his view on nature. So, okay, he talks about evolution. He tries to explain larger aspects of evolution, and that evolution builds on something that has been produced before. So therefore, we also build upon the nature of lobsters, for example. And we can understand then ourselves with regard to these primitive brains. That's a bit weird, but let's look at some more arguments that he makes for that case. So how does he perceive nature? First, it is easy to assume that nature is something within nature, something static. But it's not, at least not in any simple sense. It's static and dynamic at the same time. The environment, the nature that selects itself transforms. And then he comes with this yin and yang again. This time it's yin and yang, not yang and yin. Okay. And he brings in here the Taoists again. Taoism, as I would say. So being for the Taoist, reality itself is composed of two opposing principles, often translated as feminine and masculine, or even more narrowly as female and male. And he claims that it's more accurately understood as chaos and order. And it is true, like we have an ontology in Taoism. The question is how seriously the Taoist takes these principles. So, for example, Peterson claims that that is a principle of being. I think Chinese don't even have the word being. So I really wonder if they grasp reality itself, or whether they say, look, this is a principle by which you live. Peterson would probably agree with regard to chapter 2, because he says it's not about the state of things, but it's more about the way we act. The only thing that I would like to point out here is, okay, we determine an ontology that nature is supposed to follow. Like, how do we know that ontology? Well, it seems we have to observe nature. Then how do we abstract that ontology from it if it's the most fundamental ontology and if we don't presuppose it? And I think that's what he does. He just presupposes that and then says, look, you find it everywhere. And that seems to me a confirmation bias. So I want to explain very quickly, therefore, the principle of confirmation bias. So how do I usually teach something like confirmation bias? I once saw that in the New York Times, and it was a very good example. Let's say, oh, here we have already everything written down, but actually I wanted to write it down myself, but it just remembered me, which is great. Okay, so let's say we have a order of numbers, and it's 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. And I wonder, okay, which can be the next number? And you can test that number, but I'm not interested so much in the number as I'm more interested in what rule does apply. So which numbers are correct continuations? So again, you should only tell me the rule, however, if you know what the rule is. So if you tell me the wrong rule, then I have to say, I'm sorry, that's the wrong rule. And that was your chance. So now, like, you can think about it, but I tell you actually what students usually do, and it's usually a good experience, right? So usually students ask me 32. I say, that's right, that's a correct continuation. And then they tell me, well, the rule is multiplication by 2. And then I say, no, that's false. That's not the rule. You lost the game, right? And so what they do is they have a rule in their mind, and then they look for an example that confirms it. And as soon as it is confirmed, they say, oh, therefore it must be right. But so this is actually where we should rather apply a process of falsification, right? And so now we should test it actually. Okay, 32, that is a candidate. But let me also, it does not cost anything here except a little bit of time. Let's also test 17. And I say 17 is also right. And then they say 18. I say 18 is also right. 16 is actually wrong. 15 is also wrong. And 2 is also wrong. And the rule here it's quite disappointing then for the students. The rule is actually that the following number has to be bigger than the number before. And what happens here is a so-called confirmation bias, that we have these rules in our mind, and then we look for examples that actually confirm our rule. And the same is probably true for the Pareto principle. And then we suddenly come up and say, look, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and Tchaikovsky, they wrote the major corpus of classical music that is played nowadays. Pareto principle. And we don't even test that very much. I don't think it's very scientific here, right? I don't think that Pareto principles just magically occur with regard to such instances. With regard to language, Zipf's law actually occurs, but that's a very impressive and astonishing fact. If you ask me, it's way more mathematical in that instance. Okay, so but why is this a problem here for Peterson in case of his ontology? Because he formulates a rule now, a rule of being, that it follows chaos and order. And now suddenly, like somebody who talks of pregnant women, sees all the time pregnant women on the streets, which he has never seen before, and then he believes, oh, everybody gets pregnant now. Like suddenly he finds everywhere chaos and order. And this reflective mode is not wrong, can help you to structure the world maybe in a better way, but it's a bit absurd to say, well, therefore that must be the ontology of the universe, right? Can be that the universe follows actually another rule that includes chaos and order, but it may be more complex or far more simple, and so on and so forth. So I hope this is clear here, and I think that our method of science has therefore changed. We don't start with an ontology anymore, and then we look for examples that confirm us. Usually we start with a hypothesis that we then try to falsify. And this is just to simplify. So what I say here is a simplification of the scientific process, which probably is way more complex. And I think if we don't want to slide into pseudoscience, and I don't want to say that Peterson here is pseudoscience, he's probably way more a psychologist in his specific field, but now he extends his methods to something that is ontology, which may be more the field of a philosopher, right, like me. So I would say here, this argument is a bit problematic, and we will derive a kind of weird science from it that does not work that simply. So I'm more of the opinion that we should work indeed phenomenologically, which he does in the second chapter. So we should observe phenomena and then maybe come up with a possible ontology that later can be changed. And so in that sense, I don't necessarily have something against an ontology of chaos and order, but at the same time I say that's a working hypothesis, while Peterson claims this is a principle of reality. And to me, as a trained philosopher, I would say that's a bit naive. So now we see him expanding on his principles of nature. I would prefer if he said, okay, I grasp nature in this sense, and then I can actually suggest to you a rule of how to deal with it. Maybe nature changes at some point. Maybe you figure out exceptional cases. Then maybe you also have to establish different rules. That's what I would call pragmatism, by the way. But he does not do that. He just talks about the way nature is. And I think this is kind of a hardcore metaphysical realism, which I don't think works nowadays anymore. But of course, there are also philosophers who are, let's call it metaphysical realists. So now he says, okay, nature is not simply dynamic either. Some things change quickly, but there are also stable systems. And then the dynamic systems within the stable systems are in a larger dynamic system, which is in a larger stable system. So here we already see a boxing of boxes into different boxes, which I find interesting, but which speaks more to me for the fact that it's not a simple ontology as he suggests. And then he says, it's chaos within order, within chaos, within higher order. The order that is most real is the order that is most unchanging. And that's not necessarily the order that is most easily seen. And then he says, and some things that are most real, such as the ever-present dominance of hierarchy, cannot be seen at all. Okay, maybe my impression of Peterson is not on point. But yeah, it's interesting that he very confidently knows here that the dominance hierarchy is the most real thing. Well, what does that mean? Like, we have to accept dominance in our society. We cannot hope for equality. We cannot hope for maybe just equality. We just have to follow the lobster nature in us. That does not sound appealing to me. It sounds like this Stoic philosophy that especially Silicon Valley often propagates, right? You have to accept what nature is. I think nature may be changeable too. Maybe it's static. We can develop different hypotheses, we can develop different views on it, and I think science has not come to a definite conclusion on that aspect so far. Yeah, and now he comes up with this kind of hypothesis that nature is basically evil. Maybe also a hypothesis that Hobbes, in confrontation with Rousseau, would claim if Mother Nature wasn't so hell-bent on our destruction, it would be easier for us to exist in simple harmony with her dictates, right? So now we have like this idea that we have to fight with nature, that nature does not give us a nice habitat where we can live. So, and I mean, Rousseau would look at it in a different way with his imagined state, original state of human beings, which is not an empirical state. And I think, what was his name? Bernard? I have to look it up. Yeah, I think Bernard Williams would go into a similar direction where we imagine a different state of nature where we look at it more positively. So I think the motivation to look negatively on nature is also a bit problematic. Like he says, it is also a mistake to conceptualize nature romantically. So, yeah, but I mean, to conceptualize nature as negative, like, okay, who's right? Maybe we shouldn't come to a conclusion on these issues, right? But then he says, and this brings us to a third erroneous concept, that nature is something strictly segregated from the cultural constructs that have emerged within it. And yeah, I mean, this so then culture is the order within the chaos and order of being is all the more natural the longer it has lasted. This because nature is what selects. So I think what he wants to say is that culture is subordinated to nature. I think that's what he wants to say. It's not entirely clear. Yeah, so it's not that we establish nature, culture against nature, but culture somehow emerges out of nature. So we are still a product of that kind of natural Darwinist selection. And again, like what about phenomena of emergence, that there are new properties on top of a natural process? That's a whole theory that cannot be simply rejected, right? But then he says all that matters from a Darwinian perspective, and here we clearly see that he sides with Darwin, is permanence. And the dominance hierarchy, however social or cultural it might appear, has been around for some 500 million years. It's permanent. The dominance hierarchy is not capitalism. It's not communism either, for that matter. It is instead a near eternal aspect of the environment. Okay, I cannot do the Peterson impression here. I have to practice a little bit more. And much of what is blamed on these more ephemeral manifestations is a consequence of its unchanging existence. So yeah, and that's for me a leap in his thoughts. I mean, we observe hierarchies in nature, and then it's not excluded that we also observe hierarchies in cultures. But that does not mean that they are related. It's a hypothesis that our cultural hierarchies are the same as the hierarchies we see in nature. Dominance hierarchies are older than trees. Okay, I have to stop the Peterson. the part of our brain that keeps track of our position in the dominance hierarchy is therefore exceptionally ancient and fundamental. Okay, this is why when we are defeated, we act very much like lobsters who have lost the fight. And then, yeah, he says, okay, we are also acting like low ranking lobsters when we are defeated. And we have this primordial calculator then in our brain that monitors exactly our position in society. And yeah, that's basically who we are. And if you're a bottom lobster, you're of minimal romantic interest to anyone unless they are as desperate as you. Great, great. And I mean, okay, what about people who don't feel pity for someone or who are not desperate, but who feel something like compassion, which may be a general possibility, right? And then people say, no, this warm glow feeling that you have inside of you is just another egotistical drive of nature for humankind to survive. That's another larger discussion on that. But again, I think it cannot be that simply solved. So he goes on with his talks on evolution, which we will actually skip. So it's more important what he thinks follows from that. And it means that you can now come into a position where you are a subordinate, a bottom lobster, and then what will happen to you is that you will be bullied. He actually gives some sources. He shows that people who have victim behavior will be rather chosen as the bully. And they also often have some weird beliefs that you should be a pacifist and that you should not believe these, like they have a belief in non-violence and so on. And so these people who are bullied, that are the people who often won't fight back. And this is all based on this idea of what the underlying nature of that is. And it's very unfortunate because I think that we can also solve the problem of bullying in societies if we educate the bullies and if we regulate the bullies as a society and not expect the individual to necessarily fight back, which may lead to war. So if you say no early in the cycle of oppression and you mean what you say, then the scope for oppression on the part of the oppressor will remain properly bounded and limited. So, and this is also how he believes tyrannies can be defeated. I actually should also mark that, right? The forces of tyranny expand inexorably to fill the space made available for their existence. So you need actually individuals, here again his libertarianism, who believe in themselves and who stand up, who straighten their cross and who say, no, you are not bullying me. Okay, and yeah, here is what I said before. Naive, harmless people usually guide their perceptions and actions with a few simple axioms. People are basically good. Simple axiom, right? No one really wants to hurt anyone else. The threat of force, physical or otherwise, is wrong. These axioms collapse or worse in the presence of individuals who are genuinely malevolent. Worse means that naive beliefs can become a positive invitation for abuse and so on and so forth. So yeah, I believe that people want to live just and equal lives. I don't think people prefer the state of inequality. I think that, let's say that way, unjust inequality propels the belief that you have to make it in that order. But once you experience a just community, like let's say a very good high school where you go, where people treat each other with respect and have a common understanding that we should not have unjust inequality and bully each other, these people will find much better lives than always fighting in this Hobbesian state of human wolves who will just kill you behind your back. So yeah, I would say that Peterson actually drives us to a kind of Hobbesian interpretation, right? So, And it's interesting that he now wants to say, well, people also have to discover the evil side in themselves. I mean, I kind of agree with that. We should not put the monster into the other. And he says that these people are often suffering from post-traumatic stress diseases. This is actually an interesting idea that he has. Something that I, for example, also see in Foucault, who demands that we shouldn't put the monster into the other, but we should find the monster in us. And especially war or soldiers who have been in war and committed these acts, they usually suffer from a post-traumatic stress disease because they see what they can do. They react like the monsters they can truly be in extreme battlefield conditions, and the revelation of that capacity undoes their world. And no wonder, perhaps they assumed that all of history's terrible perpetrators were people totally unlike themselves. Yeah, we probably all have that capacity in us to do horrible deeds. And the question is, how do we react in a situation of pressure and violence? And for my part, I hope that I won't, but I probably also believe that I'm capable of bad actions under extreme stress and warlike situations. But again, this is like a society that makes us, not necessarily that this has to be me, right? And it's the societal conditions that bring out different aspects of us. So let's say if I never kill somebody, does that mean, and I die, does that mean that I still have been a potential killer? So this is a question that, for example, Aristotle would ask. If I never actualize my potential, have I still been a killer? So it's what the only thing I want to say here is, again, it's more complicated. It's not that our nature is being a killer. I don't see that. And why is that the case? Because I think, as Nietzsche would say, humans' nature is to not have a nature. We can actually ultimately change our nature, or as Hegel would say, our nature is to be free, radical free. Not free that we can fly or something, of course, but it's not determined of who we want to become in the future. And it's not determined that in the battlefield we will all find the monsters in ourselves. It's not determined, as Peterson says here. Possibility, but maybe you won't be the monster, right? Yeah, and then interestingly, I would like to see more background on this, more studies where he says that actually the most suffering individuals were his, do you say clients? Yeah, clients. These were the ones who came from hyper-sheltered families where nothing terrible is allowed to exist and everything is feral and wonderful. So, and that's where we really wonder what it is. Is it the kind of snowflake generation that usually the right wing criticizes? Is it that what he means? Or is it really a family where the prevention of violence is pathological, where they don't let children see, for example, violence or war on TV, and where they only have a beautiful surrounding? But I would say this even applies more to families who are usually grouped into the right-wing spectrum, like let's say super Christian families who heavily regulate what their children watch, for example, on TV. Yeah, so good so far. So now what he wants to say in this situation, I mean, you cannot change everything. He says you need to stand up, and that means to voluntarily accept the burden of being, voluntarily accepting inequality. And I can kind of agree with that. So you have to not surrender to the feeling of injustice, that the world was always mean for you, and like cultivate these aggressions. You have to accept that the world sometimes is unjust, and you have to work your best within this kind of injustice. That's what I want to say. And so not focusing on injustice, that means to accept the inequality and try to work yourself up. But that's easier said than done. So let's say you are a person in the third world and you read this book and you belong to like I don't know, a family that really has no chances to get out of there, what does it help that you straighten your back when you fight every day for your existence? So yeah, it's a bit of a first world problem here. It's written for somebody who is supposed to survive in capitalist Canada and America, who do quite well in terms of wealth and who allow for a lot of opportunities to get out of these situations. Yeah, and he goes on here by writing, okay, to stand up straight with your shoulders back is to accept the terrible responsibility of life with eyes wide open. It means dedicating to voluntarily transform the chaos of potential into the realities of a habitable order. I always just have the same Peterson. I should vary a little bit about it. So yeah, so this is what he wants to say. You can actually make an impact. And then he finishes this chapter. Then you may be able to accept the terrible burden of the world and find joy. Look for your inspiration to the victorious lobster with its 350 million years of practical wisdom. The lobster holding practical wisdom. Yeah, forgive me that a philosopher has to laugh here a little bit. I give you a definition that I got from Sloterdijk once. I think I got it in one of his seminars, and he said, wisdom is the return from extremes. And so I think it's good in one phase of your life to read a lot of Jordan Peterson, and then to read the opposite extreme, and then maybe to return from these extremes and see that wisdom is not in the social Darwinism, metaphysical realism that is rooted in something like an acclaimed ontological order of nature. Okay, however, stand up straight with your shoulders back and submit to Jordan the Lobster Peterson.